Snow had been falling on Millhaven, Wyoming since before noon, the kind that doesn't hurry. That settles into the cracks of old buildings and softens the edges of everything until the world looks like a place that has made its peace with being quiet. It was late November, 2 days before Thanksgiving, and the only light still burning on Main Street came from a small diner with a hand-painted sign that said, Retta's, the second E slightly lower than the rest, as though it had been added as an afterthought. Daniel Hurst had not planned to stop. He had been driving for 9 hours and had 4 more ahead of him, and no particular reason to be in Millhaven at all. But in the passenger seat, Scout turned his head toward the window and made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a growl. The sound he made when something required attention. Daniel looked where the dog was looking. Through the diner window, visible in the yellow light, an elderly woman stood alone behind the counter, and something in the way she stood, the particular stillness of a person who has been alone for a long time and has learned to carry it without performance, made Daniel pull off the road without deciding to. What that Marine and his K9 found inside Retta's diner that November night would unravel a secret 3 years in the making, expose a cruelty hidden behind the language of family, unreturned to one man everything the war had taken from him without his permission. If this is your first time here, stay. This is the kind of story this channel tells. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Daniel Hurst had enlisted at 22, later than most. After 2 years of community college and 1 year of working a loading dock in Cheyenne that had taught him he could lift heavy things indefinitely but could not tolerate a life without purpose. He had a younger sister named Kara, a mother who called every Sunday, and a father who expressed pride through silence and firm handshakes, which Daniel had spent years learning to read correctly. A joined because he believed in the idea of service, not abstractly, not from a poster, but in the specific way that some people believe in keeping their word. A was deployed to Kandahar at 23. He came home at 25. What he brought back with him, besides his rank and his discharge papers and a scar along his left forearm from a vehicle rollover outside Spin Bulldog, was the memory of a man named Corporal Ray Medina. Ray had been from Odessa, Texas. He had a daughter named Sophia who was 4 years old when he deployed, and who had sent him a drawing of a dog wearing a hat, which Ray had kept folded in his front pocket for 11 months. Ray had died on a Wednesday in March, not in combat, not dramatically, but in the way some things end. Suddenly, with no warning in the middle of an ordinary day, when an IE took the vehicle ahead of theirs, and the shockwave did what shockwaves do. Daniel had been 20 feet behind him. He had not been able to get to him in time. He had carried that 20 feet ever since. Back home, he found that the things that had once structured his days, the Sunday calls, the handshakes, the purposeful mornings, felt slightly wrong in his hands, like tools made for someone else. He moved twice in 3 years. He worked construction, then logistics, then nothing for 6 weeks that he did not talk about. It was not broken in the way people use that word carelessly. He was more like a compass that had been near something magnetic, still functional, still pointing, but no longer certain of north. Scout had been his partner in the last 8 months of his second tour. A Belgian Malinois, 68 pounds, the color of autumn grass, with one ear that folded at the tip from an old injury nobody had documented and nobody could explain. They had worked together with the specificity that forms between two creatures who have trusted each other in places where trust is the only currency that matters. When Daniel separated from service, he had filed the adoption paperwork before he filed anything else. Scout slept on the passenger seat of his truck. He ate when Daniel ate. On the mornings when Daniel sat at the kitchen table without pouring his coffee, Scout would put his chin on Daniel's knee and wait. Not pushing, not demanding, just present. The way Scout was always present, which was completely and without reservation. Daniel had been driving toward his mother's house in Colorado for Thanksgiving. He had taken the long route without explanation, the way he sometimes did, adding hours to a trip because arriving felt like something he needed to earn. He had been on the road since before dawn, and Millhaven had appeared out of the snowfall like something that had always been there and simply hadn't been visible until now. Her name was Retta Calloway. She was 87 years old, and she had run the diner on Main Street in Millhaven for 44 years, since the autumn of 1980, when she and her husband Frank had bought it from a retired couple named Pomeroy and stayed up 3 nights repainting the interior in a color Frank called honest yellow. Frank had died 11 years ago. Retta had kept the yellow. She had been born in this valley, grown up in this valley, married in the Methodist church 6 blocks from the diner, buried her husband from the same church, and raised one son, Gerald, in the apartment above the diner where she still lived, in the same bedroom where she had read Gerald his bedtime stories until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it, and then a little longer after that because she had known, even then, that the window for such things closes faster than you expect. Reta had cooked everything from scratch for 44 years. Soups, pies, biscuits, a pot roast on Fridays that the entire town had organized its week around for 3 decades. She knew the names of her customers' children and their children's children. She had extended credit quietly during the bad years, without recording it anywhere because she did not want anyone to feel the weight of the record. She had been the kind of woman a town relies on without knowing it, relies on her until the day she is no longer there. She had not planned to still be running the diner at 87. She had planned, vaguely, on Gerald helping her. On the business passing naturally, the way good things pass, with warmth and continuity and someone younger learning the soup recipe by standing beside her at the stove. Gerald lived in Denver now. He had for 9 years. He called on birthdays sometimes. What Retta had not planned on was Gerald's business partner, a man named Clifton Marsh, who had begun appearing in Millhaven 18 months ago, with a smile that arrived before the rest of his face and a briefcase full of documents about Retta's future. She still set a place for Frank at the counter every morning, his stool, the one with the slightly uneven leg that he had always meant to fix. She never sat in it herself. Daniel pushed open the diner door, and the warmth came at him like a physical thing. The warmth of a kitchen that had been running all day. That smelled of coffee and something savory, and the particular sweetness of pie cooling on a rack. Scout stepped in beside him and sat immediately, scanning the space with the calm efficiency of a dog who had learned to assess environments quickly, and had decided this one was safe. Retta looked up from behind the counter. She was small, white-haired, wearing an apron over a wool sweater, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of face that has been shaped by decades of paying attention to other people. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Scout. "I don't have a no-dogs policy," she said. "Never saw the point." "Appreciate it," Daniel said. "Sit anywhere. I'll bring coffee." She brought it without asking how he took it, which turned out to be exactly right. Black, no sugar. And set a bowl of water on the floor for Scout without being asked, which Scout accepted with the dignified gratitude of a dog who expects nothing and appreciates everything. Daniel had not planned to order food. He had planned to sit for 20 minutes and get back on the road. But Retta set a bowl of soup in front of him, 8 minutes later, without taking an order. And the smell of it, beef and root vegetables, and something herb that he couldn't name, reached some part of him that had been cold for a long time. "You didn't order," she said, "but you look like you haven't eaten since this morning, and it's past 8 o'clock. He hadn't. He'd forgotten the way he sometimes forgot. Had the soup. Then she brought pie, apple, from the rack, and refilled his coffee, and the snow kept falling outside the window, and the diner was empty except for the two of them and Scout. On something about the combination of warmth and silence, and the particular kindness of being fed without having to ask for it, loosened something in Daniel's chest that he hadn't realized was tight. He did not say much. Retta did not seem to require it. She moved around her kitchen with the ease of someone in complete command of her space, and occasionally she said something about the snow, about Millhaven, about the pie recipe that had come from Frank's mother, and which she had made every Thanksgiving for 40 years. And Daniel listened, and Scout lay under the counter with his chin on his paws, and the evening took on the quality of something outside ordinary time. It was Scout who moved first. The dog stood up from beneath the counter without being directed, walked to the door at the back of the kitchen, the one that presumably led to the office or storage, and sat down in front of it. It turned his head and looked at Daniel with the specific quality of attention that meant this. "What's through there?" Daniel asked. Retta's hands stilled on the counter. A fraction of a second. Barely perceptible, but Daniel had spent years reading fractions of seconds. "Who's the office?" she said. "Storage. Nothing interesting." Mind if I take a look? A pause longer than the first? Then, it's just papers. Gerald's been going through things. She opened the door herself. The office was small with a desk and shelving along one wall. The shelving had been partially cleared. Not tidied. Cleared. The gaps where objects had been suggesting removal rather than organization. On the desk sat a stack of documents, and on top of them, visible from the doorway, was a letter on legal stationery with the words, Notice of Intent, printed across the top. Daniel did not touch anything. He read what was visible from where he stood. He looked at the date. He looked at the figure in the lower third of the page. Scout stayed in the doorway and did not move. How long has this been going on? Daniel asked. Retta stood behind him for a moment. Then she said, in the careful voice of someone reciting something they have rehearsed, Gerald feels the diner isn't sustainable anymore. He's found a buyer. Clifton has been very helpful with the arrangements. Daniel turned around. He looked at her face, the specific expression of a woman who does not believe what she is saying and has not believed it for a long time, but has run out of alternatives. Is that what you think? He said. Or is that what you've been told to think? The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Have you ever known someone like Retta? Someone who built something with their whole life, who fed a town, who kept the light on, and then watched it be taken from them, one careful document at a time. If that person is still in your life, call them this week. If they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. The full story came out slowly, the way water finds its way through old stone. Not forced, not sudden, but inevitable. Retta talked and Daniel listened. And Scout lay across her feet beneath the counter as though he had appointed himself to that position and did not intend to vacate it. Gerald had introduced Clifton Marsh 2 years ago. An old friend, a businessman, someone who understood how to make aging properties work harder. Clifton had been helpful at first. It found a problem with the diner's commercial lease that Retta hadn't known existed. He'd offered to manage the paperwork. It explained, patiently and repeatedly, that the diner was costing more than it earned, and that a sale structured correctly would leave Retta comfortable and secure. It had documents for everything. He had explanations for the documents. He had a way of making the explanations sound like gifts. What had not mentioned, until the letter on the desk, was that the buyer was a development group out of Denver, in which Gerald held a minority stake. What he had not mentioned was that the sale price he was recommending was 60% of the assessed value. What he had not mentioned was that the notice of intent, once signed, waived Retta's right to independent appraisal. I haven't signed it, Retta said. She said it quietly, as though the fact required defending. When is the deadline? He's coming Friday. He says the buyer won't wait past the weekend. It was Tuesday evening. 3 days. Daniel looked at Scout. Scout looked at the door. Daniel thought about Ray Medina, about a drawing of a dog in a hat, folded in a front pocket carried 11 months across a country that had no interest in its existence. About 20 feet, about the specific texture of a debt that cannot be repaid to the person it is owed to, and must therefore be repaid differently, sideways across time to people Ray would never meet. In a dinner in Wyoming, in the snow, on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Ed took out his phone. He called a woman named Diane Okafor, a real estate attorney in Cheyenne whom his sister Cara had used the previous year for a property dispute and had described, specifically, as someone who does not tolerate paperwork designed to confuse elderly people. He left a voicemail at 8:40 at night. She called back at 8:57. It put her on speaker so Retta could hear. Diane Okafor listened to the summary. She asked 4 questions. After the 4th, she said, "Don't let her sign anything. I'll have someone at the diner by Thursday morning." Retta sat on her stool, not Frank's stool, her own, and looked at Scout, who had moved to sit beside her without being told. She put one hand on his head. Scout leaned into it slightly, the way he did when he had decided someone needed the weight of him. "Why are you doing this?" she said. She was not asking to be polite. She genuinely wanted to know. Daniel thought about how to answer that for a moment. "I had a friend," he said. "He didn't get help when he needed it. I think about that." Retta nodded slowly, the note of someone who understands that some answers hold more than their words. The dark blue pickup, Clifton Marshes, Daniel had confirmed by the following morning through the county registrar, appeared on Main Street Wednesday afternoon. It drove slowly past the diner twice without stopping, the way a vehicle driven by someone recalibrating will move, looking for new information. Daniel watched it from the window booth. Scout tracked it without lifting his head from his paws, only his eyes moving, steady and patient, and completely awake. Clifton arrived on Thursday at 9, 40 minutes before Diane Okafor's colleague, a young attorney named Brooks, was expected. He did not knock. The diner was open, as it was every morning, and he walked in with his briefcase and his early arrival smile, and stopped when he saw Daniel sitting at the counter. Él looked at Daniel. He looked at Scout. He looked at the door to the back office, which was closed. "I'm here to see Retta," he said. "She's in the kitchen," Daniel said. "Sit down." Something moved across Clifton's face, a calculation, quickly completed. He sat. Retta came out of the kitchen and stood behind the counter. She was wearing her apron, as always, and her reading glasses were on her nose instead of her forehead, which meant she had been doing paperwork. She set a cup of coffee in front of Clifton, without being asked, because 44 years of dinner work does not stop for a crisis, and looked at him with the steady gaze of a woman who has spent the night becoming clear about something. Scout rose from beneath the counter. He did not move toward Clifton. He positioned himself to the side of Retta, between her and the end of the counter where Clifton sat, and a low, continuous sound began in his chest, not loud, not urgent, the sound of a decision that had already been made and required only patience to complete. His eyes were fixed on Clifton. His body was still. The sound did not stop. Clifton looked at the dog. Is Hay going to be a problem?" "No," Daniel said. "He's not the problem." Clifton opened his briefcase. He removed the notice of intent and set it on the counter with the practice motion of someone who has done this many times and expects the same outcome. He uncapped a pen. He slid it toward Retta. Retta looked at the document. She looked at Clifton. She folded her hands on the counter in front of her. "Gerald called me last night," she said. "For the first time in 4 months. He wanted to make sure I was going to sign." She paused. "He asked me twice. Has never asked me for anything twice in his life." She looked at Clifton. He sounded like someone who had been told what to say. Clifton began to speak. "You never told me about Gerald's stake in the buying group," Retta said. Quiet, precise. The voice of a woman who has been running a business for 44 years and knows exactly how to end a conversation. The room did not move. Scout's growl did not change. He watched Clifton with the absolute patient attention of an animal that has made its position permanent and will not be persuaded otherwise. When Clifton reached for his pen, Scout took one step forward. One step. Nothing more. Clifton did not reach further. The door opened at 9:43, and Brooks, the attorney, came in with snow on his jacket and a messenger bag and the slightly windburned look of someone who has driven fast from Cheyenne. He set his bag on the counter, introduced himself to Retta and to Clifton, and began with the particular calm of someone who has reviewed the documents already and found what he expected to find. "If you were sitting at that counter right now, watching Retta hold her ground after 3 years of being slowly, carefully, patiently dismantled, would you have stayed? Would you have made that call? Type yes or no in the comments. I read every one." Clifton Marsh left the diner at 11:15, without the signed notice of intent. He did not speak on his way out. Scout watched him walk to his truck. Scout watched the truck pull away from the curb. Scout watched until it turned off Main Street and was gone. Then the growl stopped, and Scout turned back to Retta and walked to her and put his head against her hip and stayed there until she put her hand on him. The case was referred to the Wyoming Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division by the following Monday. Diane Okafor's firm took Retta's representation pro bono, a word Retta had to have explained to her and then thanked them for 3 separate times. The development deal was suspended, pending investigation. The diner stayed open. Gerald called again on Sunday. This time he called without being told to. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than any conversation they had had in 9 years, and what was said in it stayed between them, which is where it belonged. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like arrangement, as though the snow falls on the right road, and a dog turns his head at exactly the right window, for reasons that have nothing to do with chance. On Thanksgiving morning, Daniel sat in Retta's diner with Scout under his stool and ate a breakfast he did not have to ask for in a town he had not planned to stop in. 2 days later than he had told his mother he would arrive. His mother, when he finally called, said only, "Were you needed somewhere?" And when he said yes, she said, "Then that's where you needed to be." The pot roast was on for Friday. Retta asked Daniel if he'd be around. He looked at Scout. Scout was already lying on the floor in front of the counter with his chin on his paws and his eyes closed. The complete and settled posture of a dog who has decided where he belongs. "Looks like we might be," Daniel said. The soup had been the smallest possible thing. A bowl, set down without being asked for, in a diner on a snowy Tuesday night, because a woman who had spent 44 years feeding people recognized hunger when she saw it, even the kind that has nothing to do with food. It had not known, when he sat down, that he was going to find something he had lost. It had not known what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of the kind of loyalty he had been trying for 3 years to figure out how to give. It had thought the debt ran one direction, from him forward into the world, trying to account for 20 feet on a Wednesday in March. It had not understood that debts of that kind sometimes find their own way of completing the circle, in places you did not plan to stop, in the middle of an ordinary snowfall. Through the window of a diner with a hand-painted sign and an E that sits slightly lower than the rest. What Daniel Hurst did that November was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean the word. He was tired. He was behind schedule. He had every reason to keep driving. He simply listened to his dog. This story is for everyone who has kept the light on past the point where it made sense. In a diner, in a marriage, in a friendship, in a family. And wondered if anyone would ever notice. Someone noticed. Someone always notices. It just sometimes takes the right dog on the right road, on the right night. Is there a Retta in your life? Someone who has been feeding people, in every sense of that word, for longer than anyone has thought to say thank you? Tell me their name in the comments. Let's fill this section with the names of people who have kept the light on. I read every one. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you longest? I'll see you in the comments.